Let's roll.
All right.
Camera.
Okay.
So I am Dan Little, and I am pleased to get a chance to talk with Robert Sellers about some recent history in the field of social psychology. Thank you, Rob, for being willing to do this today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Dan.
Rob is Vice Provost for Equity and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer at the University of Michigan. He is an accomplished social psychologist. He is the Charles D. Moody Collegiate Professor of Psychology, Professor of Education, and former chair of the Department of Psychology. So I find Rob a very reflective thinker about the ways in which race and academic life intersect in America. And that intersection is just a hugely fraught one. So I'm really happy that we got a chance to have this conversation today. Rob, you and I had a recent conversation about some of the four founding social psychologists in this country: James Jackson, Claude Steele, James Jones, and Jim Sidanius. It is interesting that at least two of these men have roots at the University of Michigan, and maybe others, I'm not positive.
Yes.
But today I would like to get your thoughts and your memories of these men and their, both what led them to be the scientists that they are and how race played into that, and then in turn how their insights folded out into some really important new developments in the field of social psychology. So welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. So when I think about these four men, three Jims and a Claude, Jim Sidanius, James Jackson, James Jones, and Claude Steele, they represent an important example of the way that race, and particularly the impact of African American psychology on the field of social psychology has changed. So all four men grew up approximately the same time, were born in the late 40s, grew up in the 50s, and came of age in the late 60s and early 70s in terms of their careers as psychologists, and have been foundational individuals in the field of social psychologists ever since. And they really tell a broad story. So James Jackson, who is currently a professor here in a distinguished professor here at the University of Michigan in psychology and in gerontology, former director of the Institute for Social Research, is well-renowned, a member of the National Academies of Medicine and Science, is a local story. James was born and raised in Inkster, Michigan, and
so only 30 miles east of here.
30 miles down the road. Went to undergraduate at Michigan State University and got his master's degree at the University of Toledo and went on to get his PhD at Wayne State. He was the second African American faculty member at the time when he came to the Department of Psychology at the University of Michigan in 1971. He was part of the founding group with Jerry and Pat Gurin for the National Survey of Black Americans, which was the first national probabilistic study of African American psychosocial lives. James has, through the years, made huge impacts in the field of psychology, gerontology, political science. He is the founder of the Program for Research on Black America, which was the leading producer of African American psychologists and social scientists from the 70s through the 2000s. James's impact in the field is innumerable. He's received just about every one of the highest honors that the field of psychology can offer. When one thinks of James, one thinks of a psychologist who really expanded beyond our traditional notions and theories of psychology to first and foremost make it clear that the study of African Americans in and of themselves was important to understand for our understanding of behavior. Up until the early 70s, much of the field of psychology, even though African Americans have been studied for since the beginning of social psychology here in America, they were always studied as an example of what happens when either you have a group that has suffered from significant oppression and stigma, or a group that was somehow less than to begin with, is an example of a deficit, and always studied in comparison with whites as normal psychological behavior. And the work of James Jackson in particular, but others that we'll talk about as well, really began to make the case that the first and foremost African Americans are psychologically human, that their experiences are experiences that are worthy of study in and of themselves, that their experiences also tell us something about the broader human condition. And so James is probably the first mainstream psychologist, African American psychologist, who unapologetically focused his work specifically and totally on African American populations, as opposed to work that used a comparative approach. So
it's, I won't pursue this, but
please.
One of the things that I infer from what you've just said about James is that the discipline of psychology brought with it kind of a heritage of racialized, maybe racist assumptions, which James's work was able to kind of disrupt and even explode in the field.
Absolutely. So really, if you think about it, if you look at much of the research on African Americans from as early as the early 1900s up through the 60s and 70s, and many would argue even through today, there was a sense that African Americans were damaged in some way, shape, or form. And it's not surprising. So, and in fact, if you didn't think of them as being damaged, then it was tied into a belief then somehow that African Americans were not oppressed in some way, shape, or form. So many of the most progressive thinkers of the time just assumed some sense of deficit, whether it's Kenneth Clark in psychology, W.E. Du Bois, and others who their focus was trying to provide African Americans an opportunity to be on equal footing, but in that equal footing there was always a sense that there had been some damage as a function of oppression and discrimination, which was a step up from earlier models that assumed some evolutionary immaturity, inferiority that was inherent in African Americans. The later works, as we get into the 70s, 80s, 90s, with folks like Franz Fanon with the work in the islands, and Jackson and Bill Cross and others, really emphasized the fact that African Americans, to begin with, were human, naturally healthy individuals who have gone through significant oppression.
So it's an overused term, but it's kind of a paradigm.
It's a paradigm shift. It absolutely is a paradigm shift.
So you want to talk about, would Claude be the
Yes, so Claude Steele is another extremely famous foundational researcher in social psychology. In fact, Claude Steele might be the most famous and recognized social psychologist of the current time. And Claude grew up in Chicago, did his undergrad at a small college in Ohio, Hiram College, and then went on and got his PhD in social psychology at Ohio State, the school for which we shall not name, but Ohio State right down the road. Claude, interestingly, is a twin. His twin brother, Shelby Steele, is well known at the San Jose State. I believe he's still at San Jose State. Conservative scholar around race. Claude's work is interesting. Claude began his work as a traditional experimental social psychologist. Much of his early career was focused on looking at the impact of behavioral and social context on alcohol abuse and use. He did much of this work at University of Washington early in his career. And then in the mid-'80s came to the University of Michigan. And in part through some of the efforts of James Jackson. And when Claude came to the University of Michigan in the late 80s, he began doing work specifically looking at stereotype threat. His previous work out of alcoholism really was focused on self-confirmation bias. Which basically argued that individuals are highly motivated to be consistent in the way in which they view themselves, even more so than to be aggrandizing in their view of self. With that work in terms of focusing on self, he began to look at issues related to stereotyping and stigma, and wanted to understand underperformance by a number of groups that have historically been stereotyped, including and in particular African Americans as it related to academic performance. And in developing his model of stereotype threat, which became one of the most influential psychological models, both within the field of psychology as well as public policy and other areas. Claude's work became even more visible, and his reputation grew. Left the University of Michigan, went to Stanford, and then served a role as provost at Columbia and dean of the School of Education at Stanford before becoming provost at UC Berkeley. He is now back as a professor at Stanford.
So the concept of stereotype threat seems like a really important one. If I understand your description correctly, his approach was experimental psychology.
Absolutely.
But then an important kind of theoretical idea, which is stereotype threat, the idea that performance is almost immediately impaired by the manifestation of a stereotype or a negative assumption about performance by other people around you. And then he probed that with tools of experimental psychology. Is that about right?
That is correct. That is correct. So Claude, whereas James' primary tools were survey research, large-scale surveys, really coming out of a sociological view of social psychology, Claude very much came out of the experimental motion. And Claude's idea of stereotype threat was particularly popular for a couple of reasons. One is that he pushed against some of the prevailing theories at the time, work by John Ogbu and others, that suggested that many African American kids underperformed out of a fear of acting white. and placed the blame really of a stereotyped or stigmatized performance as a function of a defective culture that was developed as an adaptive way to deal with long-term oppression. So the argument being that many African American kids de-emphasize the value of education because they were not performing particularly well, and as a way to protect the self-esteem, they devalued education and therefore didn't perform well and would stigmatize those who did by calling them acting white. So
These are the prior.
This is the prior theory. So this is the prevailing theory of John Agbo in the early 80s, mid 80s, that Claude's stereotype threat approach really replaced and debunked and was, I think, the object of Claude's focus in developing his theory on stereotype threat. And so one of the things about stereotype threat was that it argued that the individual didn't have to believe in their inferiority or their racial inferiority in terms of the ability to perform. In fact, that stereotype threat is most prominent in individuals who highly value a particular domain, and so you should see it in the highest performing individuals in a particular domain. And that as an experimental social psychologist was focused on the situational context. And the argument being that when the stereotype category is made salient or the stereotype itself is made salient, so when race is made salient, the case of African Americans and academic performance, that African Americans underperform in those situations compared to whites as a non-stereotyped group in that particular category.
It is part of the idea that the perceived assumptions of the people around the individual then lead to anxiety or stress, which then makes it more difficult to perform at a high level.
Well, so that's part of it. So that's the part of that has yet to be fully examined. So in terms of the mechanisms, some of the mechanisms is the fear of confirming the stereotype. So the individual doesn't necessarily need to see a person, so no one needs to be there other than to have that stereotype made salient to the individual. And when it becomes salient, there's an argument that either through anxiety or a loss of cognitive capacity that they underperform as a function of rumination, any number of possible underlying mechanisms that are currently being tested.
We're going to come back to each of these men, but I'd like to have kind of this level of introduction to each of them before we come back.
Sure.
Anything else that you feel like Claude should be kind of highlighted?
Well, so one of the things that was really important about Claude's work is, so while Claude was, again, highly regarded within the field of social psychology and, again, the field of psychology in general, winning also just about every lifetime achievement award within psych, is that his stereotype threat model also got picked up by the field of education, and Claude has also become a bit of a public scholar as well, and so his work has been influential in policy and other arenas.
Well, it seems like a really important application or insight which universities really need to pay close attention to. Because even, as I understand it, even well-meaning instructors are able to give that little tiny signal of negative expectation or low expectation. And I believe that Claude's experimental work shows that even those very small signals can lead to large differences in performance.
Well, so the question is still out in terms of how large those differences actually are. and I can go, I don't know how far you want to, because I have some questions about the stereotype threat.
Maybe we can come back to that.
Okay.
But,
Yeah.
would James Jones be a
Yes. Yeah. So James Jones, in contrast to Claude and James Jackson, James Jones is probably a little less well known throughout the field of social psychologists. Extremely accomplished nonetheless, but has had an impact in a number of ways, particularly in terms of providing educational opportunities for psychologists of color. So James Jones was also born in the 40s, 43 I believe, in northeastern Ohio, in Elyria, outside of Cleveland, where he was an accomplished athlete, football, basketball, all-state in golf. He is actually a member of the Elyria High School Sports Hall of Fame. James went on to get his PhD, or to get his master's degree at Oberlin College, and then to go on and get his PhD at Yale University in social psychology. And James went from Yale to becoming a professor at Harvard University for 8 years, and then moving from Harvard to the University of Delaware.
And he would have been a Yale graduate student probably late 60s, would you say?
Yes, he graduated in 67, I believe. 67, 68.
So that might be worth coming back to as
Okay.
well. You know, what those kind of
Yes.
historically specific
Yes.
circumstances were for black intellectuals in the 50s versus the 60s versus the 70s.
Absolutely, absolutely. So James is particularly important in that James's work, early work, focused on prejudice, and his first book was entitled Prejudice and Racism. And that volume was, I believe in 71, I have to check, was extremely important in the sense that it was the first volume that we're aware of that called out racism in psychology, or called out the concept of racism, and doing so from a psychological perspective in the United States. So while issues of prejudice and stereotype go back 50, 60 years, when we get to 1971, the concept of racism was a relatively new one. And so his book was one of the first books, and featured work similar to James Jackson, where the perspectives of African Americans were important in understanding the phenomena of oppression. So up until then, if you think about stereotyping, prejudice, Allport's work, others, they're all really speaking to the actor, to whites, and less so to the experiences of the individuals facing them. And one of the important aspects of James's work is looking at it from a structural perspective, and bringing in structure into these our understanding of these psychological processes.
And do you mean by that, what are the psychological consequences of living within a racialized social structure?
Absolutely, absolutely. And how does structural oppression manifest itself at an individual level, and how is it psychologically experienced and psychologically manifested? And so his work was very important there. But his major contributions, and he's later did work developing a trios model of African American culture that was based in with African American roots that focused on the import and the unique cultural experience of time, rhythm, inspiration, other-orientedness, and spirituality as being key cultural imperatives within the African American
So with
community.
maybe 100-year or 150-year time duration.
Well, so actually he would argue that it would go back to West African roots, and that those...
Some underestimate, yeah.
Yeah. So those West African roots shows commonalities across the diaspora with regards to, for example, time. So what's often referred to as CP time or island time, basically a sense of time as not being this linear fixed piece, but that is something that often overlaps the future tense and the past tense, are not diametrically opposed, but often interconnected, going back to the Sankofa bird and the idea of having, with the Sankofa bird, for example, if they're having their feet firmly planted in the present, with usually an egg in its mouth, and the bird looking back with the egg representing the future, and the head turning back representing the past, and the notion that all of those are intertwined and connected in ways that are very different.
So this is kind of a snap question, but
Sure.
in your own understanding of how things work, have you got any idea of what kind of mechanism could permit that kind of multi-century continuity of culture in actual embodied psychology?
Oh, absolutely. So through socialization practices, so whether they're transmitted not only from parent to the child, but also through spiritual, through later on the church, through narrative form, that one of the misconceptions is that slavery stopped the development of, or at least connections with traditional African cultures, which really isn't true. That there are a number of cultural characteristics that are still in practice today throughout the diaspora that seem to have the ability and their roots that go back.
So this gives culture a really powerful causal effect in the present.
Absolutely.
Again, something really worthwhile coming back to. What is James Jones's methodology? How does he approach this?
So James Jones is a experimental psychologist, but has also done surveys.
Do any social psychologists depend substantially on interviews and
Narrative forms?
narrative? Yeah.
Yeah, so I would argue that James Jones in particular would value the narrative form. I think Claude and James Jackson would argue that their work, in fact I've heard them in various talk about their work being informed very much through narratives, through conversations with grandparents. So, for instance, a concrete example, James Jackson we just developed the Distinguished Career Award in Diversity, and James Jackson was the initial recipient, and from now on the award will be named after him at the University of Michigan. And in his acceptance speech, he spent a lot of his time linking his own personal experiences and stories and the stories of his family member to the work that he is currently doing, looking at the role of racism and prejudice and African Americans' efforts at coping with those and its impact on physical health, mortality, and morbidity issues. And began the talk talking about his grandmother who was born into slavery, and talking about his mother and father and their experiences, and growing up in southeastern Michigan in the 40s, 50s as African American, and how all of that has shaped his view of the way in which African Americans experience discrimination. So, and James has also included interviews in his survey work.
So this is kind of a parenthesis, but I've been kind of interested in the work that people in cultural sociology are currently doing.
Yeah.
And interviews and kind of detailed biographies are an important piece of that kind of research. Neil Gross's intellectual biography of Richard Rorty is very detailed and tries to account for his intellectual development in these kind of practical and pragmatic terms, but also the intellectual drivers. So it's kind of a back and forth between what was he trying to get out of his career and what were the ideas which were propelling him forward. So there seems like a lot of richness in that kind of approach, and I'm just wondering if social psychologists find that to be a useful way of getting an angle on, for example, this topic. How did race influence the development of science in the 1960s and 70s?
Oh, I will speak for them. I would be shocked if they did not consider the narrative form as being fundamental to their work and their understanding of different work. So in my conversations with them over the years, it is very clear to me that much of their insight, much of the work is based on really a rich narrative understanding of the stories of not only themselves, but of people in their own lives, and particularly African American folks in their own lives. And in fact, one of the, I think, driving forces for them is the fact that when one would look at the existing literature at the time, that the way in which African Americans were described was not consistent with the people that they saw. So the prevailing paradigm at the time assumed, as I mentioned, African Americans were damaged. Ken Clark's work was set out to demonstrate that African Americans were damaged. And it's famously depicted in Thurgood Marshall's use of Clark's doll studies in the Brown case. So Marshall makes the case that in order that he tried the Brown case similarly as if he were trying a regular case of damage. And it was key for him to be able to show that segregation in some form or another had damage. That if it didn't have damage to African Americans in some way, shape, or form, then why is it bad? And so because basically psychology had all assumed that damage, and the argument was whether the damage was a function of oppression or whether the damage was a function of innate inabilities, was sort of the ground in which the argument lay. But when you get to the 1970s, and you get to folks like Jackson and others, Jones, the push is, well, we didn't necessarily say that we're all damaged. And the fundamental rationale for the damaged approach was for those who were more progressive, who were arguing that that damage was really the manifestation of oppression, was Cooley's work that basically the notion of the looking glass self, that a large part of how we view ourselves is based on how others view us. And so no one would argue that in the 20s, 30s, 40s through 70s that African Americans were not devalued by the larger society. And so if that's true, and if how you view yourself is based in large part by the way in which others view you, the assumption was that African Americans suffered from low self-esteem. And in fact, if you look at most of the research that was attempting to look at self-esteem at the time, they didn't have direct measures of self-esteem until the mid-60s with Morris Rosenberg and others. And you'd find evidence that African Americans, or the argument was every study, the goal was to find evidence that African Americans suffered from low self-esteem. If they didn't suffer from low self-esteem, then it was that was also used as evidence of low self-esteem. That anybody who was in that particular condition who didn't feel bad about themselves clearly must be delusional in some way, which is evidence again of mental health. So you were sort of damned if you did and damned if you didn't.
So just again, another parenthesis, but the Black Panthers, Muhammad Ali, the manifestation of black pride in the 1960s, I just wonder how that fits into this theory.
Well, so that's very interesting. So the Jesse Jackson, Say It Loud, I'm Black, I'm Proud, all came out of a notion that assumed that African Americans suffered from low self-esteem, which there was never any data for, and any direct data for. And there was an assumption, or a misassumption in many ways, that conflated feelings towards one's group and feelings towards oneself as if they were one and the same.
Mm-hmm.
So the problem is that African Americans, while the larger society may feel, clearly stigmatized and feel negatively towards African Americans, the reality is that within the African American community, there was a great deal of love and self-love and feeling well. So while I might,
That's totally interesting.
so I might grow up knowing that American society deems me inferior, at the same point in time, I know that I was loved and valued by my mother and my brother and my teacher and my cousin and etc. And so that sense of African Americans suffering damaged psyches really was not consistent with much of their actual experiences. And it wasn't until we began to get direct measures of African American self-esteem that we, for example, learned that, well, no, actually, African Americans typically do not have lower scores on self-esteem than whites, and oftentimes will have more positive, which led to a neo-reaction that said, see, these higher scores clearly means that it's not real self-esteem, it's some compensatory self-esteem. And so you see a lot of work, 70s, even to now, trying to understand this compensatory nature, still looking for African-American self-hatred in some way.
Interesting. The reason I mentioned Muhammad Ali is he was a figure, when I was growing up, who just seemed to express a very natural pride and confidence.
Yes.
So not compensatory at all, but just
natural. Well, and what is interesting is, so you see a person like Muhammad Ali growing up in the 60s, and the larger American culture sees that as different. Most African American communities could tell you, there's 10, 15 folks on the block. If you go back to Jack Johnson, it's just the way in which society viewed and valued. Someone like Joe Louis, who publicly demonstrated a very low-key, humble impression, was very much an act. Joe Louis knew very much that he was the baddest man on the planet, and in the right context would tell you he knew he was the baddest man on the planet. But after seeing what happened to Jack Johnson, there was a concerted effort to downgrade or to downplay the confidence, the swag, as we would call it today, that Joe Louis carried. But anyone who knew Joe Louis, who hung out with Joe Louis, knew he had the swag. Jackie Robinson got in trouble because when they first came up, there was the assumption that Jackie Robinson was, in fact, not just the assumption, but the deal that he and Branch Rickey made by not speaking out made it seem like he was, again, another humble, feckless, palatable Negro. When Jackie Robinson was one of the most fiery, fierce, self-confident competitors and men that you would ever find. But society sees what it wants, and so after the grand bargain between Jackie Robinson and Rickey for him not speaking out for 2 years, by the time Jackie left, Jackie was almost hated within baseball and American society. So we have a nice tendency to sort of whitewash our heroes and historically. Yeah. Same thing with Muhammad Ali.
Totally interesting.
Yeah.
It almost suggests a kind of a line of thinking which is more like cultural criticism rather than social psychology.
Well, but I don't think you can do cultural criticism without knowing social psychology, and you can't do good social psychology without also knowing cultural criticism.
It makes me think of James Scott's idea of repertoires and narratives of domination, and his Domination of the Arts of Resistance is the book I'm thinking of, where he's basically saying Marxists believe that oppressors have all the cards and the oppressed, have to shuffle and tip their hat, but that actually, in his understanding, people who are subject to oppression have their own vocabulary, their own way of expressing their resistance, and it's not at all. It's like what you said about the several athletes.
Oh, absolutely. No, absolutely. That's the irony, and I think some of James Jones's work, and definitely James Jackson's current work is arguing against that. So one of the things that James Jackson is currently working on is this notion that African Americans don't passively experience oppression or passively cope with discrimination, that they cope with it in lots of ways. And unfortunately, some of those ways may also have significant negative health consequences. So whether it's drinking or binge eating or eating high fats, high salty foods, they contribute, while they provide psychological short-term relief, they also provide long-term negative health consequences that come into play.
So it plays directly into the question of racial health disparities.
Absolutely.
So let's move on to Jim Sidanius.
Okay. So Jim Sidanius is actually the person that I know the least well. And I'm not sure I would actually... So James Sidanius is interesting in the sense that he also came of age at this at a similar time as Jackson, Steele, and Jones. But he spent much of his early career in overseas in Sweden, and came back in the mid '80s after spending much of his career in the '70s in Sweden, and came back with a theory of oppression across groups called social dominance orientation, SDO.
Mm-hmm.
And this theory argued that there were certain characteristics associated with oppressors and the ways in which they would interact and react to other competition and therefore lead to different forms of discrimination. So perhaps most relevant or most controversial is he makes an argument that African American males are more highly targeted and discriminated against than African American females, and argues that it's all about a group domination, that white females relative to other groups are least disadvantaged, in part because white males as the dominant group sees white females as being part of who they are. So there is definite chauvinism that comes into play, but there's a sense of still being part of their goals and their attributions. That African American males are seen as the competition, and African American females, while not part of the group, almost the sexism comes into play and are not seen as competition, but instead as potential prizes. So this theory argues that when one looks at oppression and domination, it's really has its roots in an evolutionary need to control resources, and that women are seen as resources, that most of this domination comes from the male side of things. Not that it can't also play out in other gendered ways. And his argument is, if you look at educational attainment numbers and other social mobility and social health numbers, that African American women do much better than African American males, and that African American males will suffer greater discrimination.
Mm-hmm. Does he want this to be a cross-cultural theory? So
yes.
India as well as
yes,
races?
yes, yeah. So he would view his theory as being a basic law of human behavior that cuts across groups.
Mm-hmm.
And any inter-group competition comes into play. And that it could be, you could develop analogs as a function of scarce resources and creating small minimal group paradigm. So you could create this in the lab by creating different groups. And when those groups come into play, that's where you can see some of the gender work as well.
Mm-hmm. There's another faculty member at U of M whose work I admire, Alan Gibbard, who wrote a book called Wise Choices, Apt Feelings, which is, so he is, among other things, an ethics specialist. But in that book, he was interested in the evolutionary kind of underpinnings of the capacity for moral behavior. And one of the takeaways for me is that you don't have to assume that there is an evolutionary or a selection advantage in the present for a certain set of underlying capacities. It really is maybe a 50 to 100,000 year ago advantage.
Right.
And he doesn't talk about racism or that the dominations associated with racism and sexism, but you could imagine an argument that basically says these kinds of domination no longer have a social role, but they're kind of a manifestation of a piece of our evolutionary hardware that is just really quite a regrettable inheritance.
Well, and that's exactly the way that Sidanius would frame his social dominance orientation theories, that this is something that has its roots in our evolutionary past. It was consistent with how different groups survived, so it's all tied to reproductive opportunities, which is the gendered piece to this, and that clearly things have changed, and he would argue changed much faster than the evolution has changed.
So one thing that ethics specialists are interested in is cooperation and altruism. And what are we are not rational fools.
Right.
We are able to cooperate with each other, even when there isn't a kind of formal structure that guarantees cooperation. And you can ask that kind of evolutionary history question, what are those capacities, human capacities, psychological capacities, that are kind of hardwired that make cooperation and altruism possible? So that's kind of the positive side.
Right.
The domination effects that you're talking about are the negative side, but you might say cooperation within a group is also an evolutionary heritage.
Well, and I think that he would argue that the cooperation occurs within group, and that it's the boundaries that lead to domination. So if you're seen as the out group, then domination comes into play because it's all about competition.
Interesting. So Jim Sidanius, these are interesting theories that he put forward. What is the methodology? Is he also an experimentalist?
So Jim is also an experimental sociologist, though he comes out of a philosophy background. He is currently at Harvard. He did much of his work, the SDO work, at UCLA in the 80s and 90s into the 2000s. He is probably the least known of the four. Though highly regarded within the field of social psychology. Theory is highly controversial, as you might imagine, and has pretty much sort of, relative to the other three, has been in a place of combative discussion, I guess is the best way I would frame it. So that I think that he would see himself as someone who is constantly pushing against the orthodoxy in terms of the field and
within social psychology.
Within social psychology.
It's interesting. And the orthodoxy would be what?
Well, the orthodoxy being one of a more liberal effort to be more egalitarian in view, so his work has been seen and called as sexist, and has spent a great deal of time defending the work against that charge, or at least pushing against.
So people kind of misunderstand a descriptive causal theory of domination for a validation or justification of domination?
I think that's the way that he would definitely frame it. I think he would say, don't blame me for the reality.
Right. And how do you pursue this kind of theory experimentally?
Well, so this is where you use a minimal group paradigm by making group salient, and within making those groups salient, so developing arbitrary groups, but making those groups salient, then setting up opportunities for cooperation versus competition, and seeing the extent to which...
So literally imaginary groups.
Literally imaginary groups. So his argument would be that by demonstrating the imaginary groups. Now, one of the things that I think is important in terms of his work, probably more so than the others, he has more explicitly utilized history as examples of his theories than the other three that we have talked about. So he would probably feel most comfortable in a description of, so SDO is a better explanation for understanding World War II than Stereotype Threat might be, or some other, or actually that's not the obvious one, but so he would be much more comfortable in utilizing historical trends as evidence for support of his theories.
The topic I was interested in quite a few years ago, 20 years ago, was ethnic violence. And I was visiting at the Center for International Affairs at Harvard for a couple of years. There was an ongoing seminar on ethnic violence, especially in South Asia. And the work that is done on ethnic violence is really very interesting, but it kind of intersects economic conflicts, long-term historical cultural identities. So identity is an important piece of some people's view.
Yes.
Conflict over resources, which really seems to be what Sidanius is highlighting. I guess I wouldn't say that the dominant view of ethnic violence in South Asia had to do with resources. It seems to have to do more with kind of political entrepreneurism, making use of Hindu nationalism, for example, as a political advantage, leading to violence and pogroms and pretty horrendous things over the past 50 years in India. But that it is a cultural explanation of, particular provocateurs. The Babri Mosque, for example, it was a particular building where Hindus believed it was the home of Ram, an important god, and Muslims correctly said this is an historic mosque.
Right.
And the Hindu nationalists wanted to retake, basically destroy. Well, it was a huge source of conflict between Hindus and Muslims in India, and it was absolutely used for the purpose of political entrepreneurship. It was a mobilization cause for the BJP. And but I guess the point I'm getting at is that it kind of seems like sociologists take sort of a different take. They don't think of conflict as being biologically generated, but more culturally and contingently generated.
And I think that Jim might push back and say, so the culture may be the framing of it, but what is the underlying motivation for it? And that it's that underlying motivation that is the so you could put a cognitive frame and political spin, but ultimately is there an underlying motivation that is linked back evolutionary that is about resources. That is, resources not necessarily even tangible resources, but is really about a need to dominate.
Right. So I think
and that's where I think the dominance piece is different from just the traditional resource argument.
what makes ethnic conflict in South Asia interesting is that there are structurally similar instances, one of which leads to violence, and the other leads to decades of cooperation and peaceful living together. So it's not that Hindus and Muslims just naturally come into conflict.
Yeah, and I think that he would argue that there are certain conditions that will lead you one way and other conditions that would lead you another.
That's totally interesting. So these are really important figures. One of the things I was interested in when we had our first conversation is it really is about intellectual biography.
Yeah.
I would maybe put in a little bit of just an insertion here. You yourself are an influential social psychologist of a full generation later, also from Ohio, is my recollection, Cincinnati
Yes.
kind of background. And I suppose we could ask the same question of you. How has perception of race, your own experience of race, led into the formation of your own thought? But I'd like to ask that question of all 4 or 5 of the social psychologists that we're talking about. Is there, an important set of scientific perspectives which come out of you've just identified 6, 8, 10 scientific perspectives. What I'm trying to pin down is, to what extent did the particular experiences which these men, and possibly yourself, had moving through various institutions, including graduate school. In talking with other African American intellectuals, I have often understood that the experience of graduate school is not always a happy, or was not, especially in the 60s and 70s, a happy experience for African Americans and other individuals not coming from the dominant race and culture. And I guess one of the things I'm interested in probing with you is the degree to which the experience of race has influenced and brought new insight through, through the cauldron of living an experience and then becoming a scientist who studies human experience.
Yeah. So, and this is where I think it will be tremendously important for each of them to tell their story, because what I can tell you now is more of things that I've heard from them and others who grew up at that time. So you've got to remember, this is the 60s when they're going through graduate school for the most part. And you're talking about the middle of the civil rights movement into the Black Power movement, Vietnam. It's all of them growing up in the North, a generation or so removed from family coming from the South. Deeply affected by those particular times and wanting to find a way to have an impact on the community. And I'm imagining having a significant push-pull. So the question of, well, to what extent do you believe that going off on some ivory tower research career is really having an impact in the time in which the assassination of Martin Luther King, assassination of Malcolm X a couple of years earlier, you've got riots, you've got a real question with regards to where the future of this country is going, and particularly where the future of this country is going for African Americans around race. Most talk about their family as being an important, more in this time and the experiences of their parents as being, and grandparents, and in some cases as being fundamental in driving, but also coming in places where often they were the first or only in certain spaces and places. I think that to me is the real question, and it's ironic that in the case of Jackson and Jones, their work focused on African Americans from the very beginning, whereas Steele and Sidanius were in more mainstream questions of psychology. And not that race was any less an important construct in their lives, but that grew up at a time where the real issue of are you making a contribution to the struggle if you're a credit to your race, and that credit to your race notion being, is achievement in mainstream American society enough, or is it something that, quite frankly, should be shunned in a different way? So one of the things that I'm always interested in hearing is their struggles, because you had another group of psychologists, African American psychologists, who became more radical in their work. So so these four were all impactful in mainstream psychology, social psychology. But during the early 70s, you also have the development of a black psychology that morphs into an African psychology in the mid-80s and 90s.
Mm-hmm. Who would be a couple of examples?
So you'd have people like Kobe Cabone, Naeem Akbar.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's totally interesting. It's a topic probably needs its own discussion.
Yes.
But it is exactly on the topic that I was interested in, which is how the experience
Excuse me.
The experience of race and the experience of one's own race creates a scientific identity, or at least it creates a pathway of development of one's thought. And I guess I wasn't aware that Jackson, Steele, Jones, and Sidanius, in one sense, are the kind of the more centrist group.
Yeah.
But that there are, it's to me also very interesting that Steele's brother is not centrist at all. He's on the conservative
side. Yes.
But that there's also, I mean, it's not a surprise to me, but it's interesting that there's also a more radical activist, possibly Afrocentrist piece of the discipline as well.
Well, so the Association of Black Psychologists is a fundamental point of divergence or focus of this. So in, I believe it was 69, there was 68, there was a set of protests of the American Psychological Association. And a number of young black psychologists, really psychology students and early psychologists, broke away from APA out of a sense of APA not understanding and what black psychology was about. They brought in Kenneth Clark, who was an extremely important figure who belonged to the previous generation of black psychologists. And so Clark's work, as I had mentioned before, was prominent in the Brown decision, and Kenneth Clark was part of the Harlem Renaissance and did some really important work in Harlem in developing clinics and other spaces, and his work on the doll studies were also very pivotal. But he was a generation ahead, and they brought him in to try to talk the younger black psychologists out of the protest, which
So the APA brought him in.
APA. So he had been a past president of APA and had been very prominent. And it's actually ironic. It's very, very similar to what happened with the '68 protest at the '68 Olympics. So with bringing in Jesse Owens to try to talk the black athletes out of the boycott, which actually for some of the athletes didn't boycott and led to Tommy Smith and John Carlos there. It's similar kind of situation where they brought in an individual from a different generation with a different, very different perspective, led to a lot of turmoil, led to the black psychologists walking out and developing the Association of Black Psychologists. Jackson and Jones were founding members of the Association of Black Psychologists in that walkout. Over time, through the by the time you get to the mid-'70s, Jones and Jackson are not involved in ABPSI. ABPSI has become more radical, I guess would be the closest frame, or they would argue more authentic in terms of a focus on an African psychology, a focus on away from and in direct opposition to the mainstream psychologist. And so you end up with the development of a whole organization where with a strong Afrocentric focus and an African-centric focus to its approaches. And so you have this interesting dichotomy. Flip side, James Jones, one of James Jones's most important contributions was as the director of the Minority Fellowship Program. So as the director of the Minority Fellowship Program, which James did in, I believe, took over in 1979, I believe, or 80, up until the early 2000s. This was a program that provided members of underrepresented groups with fellowships to graduate school, 4-year fellowships, and it was from that money that a number of scholars of color, psychologists of color, were able to go and get the graduate career. And it
was done through APA?
Through APA. So you have this dichotomy of groups such that ABPSI worked very hard to actually stay away from the influence of APA and to create a organization on its own footing. For many years holding its meeting deliberately away from APA, and in effect almost asking its members to choose.
Totally interesting, Rob.
Yeah.
I think we have a lot more to talk about. I know our time today is limited. So for today, I would like to thank you for an amazingly stimulating kind of introduction to these foundational contributors to the field of recent social psychology. I hope we'll be able to continue this conversation, but in the meantime, thank you for this excellent introduction and discussion.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it, Dan. I appreciate the opportunity.